Alright everybody, Paul Stecewycz with Weeks Aircraft doing a quick update on the Bf-108 restoration. We're going to talk about four things in this video. We're going to talk about the original paint and paint schemes and some of the research we did on that. We're going to briefly talk about where do you start a restoration. We had some people kind of ask us that question quite a bit on some of the feedback on the videos that we did. We're also going to talk about some of the sins that we've found along the way so far, because that's one of the wonderful things about aircraft restoration is you come across all these unbelievably bad things that were done to the aircraft by other people. We're going to talk about that, and then we're also going to talk about some really interesting artifacts we found inside the airplane, which is also interesting because it's a little bit of a time capsule in that regards. But the first thing is paint. We've been wondering what the original paint scheme is of the airplane. We did a lot of research. We got some information from some people that wasn't very accurate, and eventually I was hooked up with a gentleman in Germany who did a lot of research on serial number 1914, that's the work number of this airplane, and found out that the research that I did on it, and also what he did, that this airplane was originally purchased from the factory, or close to when it was built, by Carlos del Campo Riviero. He was a Chilean. He was the president of Chile from 1927 to 31. Then I believe he was president again in the 1950s. And that airplane was purchased by him from the factory. And we actually have an original photograph taken at Regensburg at the factory that shows this airplane in its correct scheme, which was dark blue. Now we've actually sanded down the airplane in several places and we've confirmed that, and you can actually see the dark blue, and then there's a layer of gray. I don't know what the gray is, a top coat, or if it's just a primer. It could be. And then on top of that is a nice cream color, 05 cream. And then the last color scheme, of course, is the Autovise scheme, which is this kind of browny tan color. So after going to several places around the airplane, very carefully stripping certain parts of it, we've confirmed that that is the original color. Now, the only thing is we don't really want to paint the airplane to represent Carlos del Campo's airplane. It was Chilean. We want to represent the aircraft as a German airplane. So we're still up in the air about paint schemes. We're still throwing out the idea of the Messerschmitt scheme, which was the cream color with the blue nose, which is a nice scheme. There are a lot of different ways we can go, so we haven't really decided on that. The next thing we're going to talk about is where do you start a restoration? This question is thrown out all the time. It's an interesting question, and basically, if you can start from the center of the airplane, it's kind of a good thing. If you have a center section, it's kind of good to work from that part out. But realistically, restoration is not really a linear action. It kind of moves back and forth and zigzags quite a bit. So even though I would decide, maybe I'm only going to work on one part. Say I decide I'm going to work on just the right wing. I'm going to restore the right wing. I'm going to do nothing else. I'm going to finish that right wing. And that's all in good, and you have good intentions to do that. But what happens along the way is while you're working on that right wing, or the fuselage, or whatever piece you decide you're going to start and finish, somewhere along that line, you're going to have to stop, because you either have to wait for a part, you have to wait for information, you found damage that you have to have somebody else take care of. So eventually you have to move on to another part of the airplane. So the answer to the question, where do you start a restoration, truly is, it doesn't really matter, because it all has to get done. So you end up jumping around a lot, which sounds inefficient, but unfortunately that's the way most restorations go. And that's just not my personal experience, but talking to other people also, is that unfortunately you have to move around on a restoration because you have to keep busy. Now I could be working on something and stop and say, well, I can't go any further. But then I'm just standing around, and of course Kermit's going to come into me and say, well, what are you doing? I said, well, I'm not doing anything because I'm waiting for information or parts. Well, he's not going to like that. He says, well, you work on something else. So that is truly what happens during a restoration. So, and that's also one of the reasons actually why it takes so long. And we're going to have to do another video also on how long all this takes and why it takes so long. Next thing we're going to talk about are sins we found along the way. Come follow me. Alright, so we're going to talk about some things we found along the way on the 108. We're not actually doing any like restoration work at this time. Basically what we're doing is we're just taken the evaluation airplane a little bit further, and that means taking off some components, removing some paint, just taking a closer look at some things. And this is when you find all kinds of interesting things. The first thing I kind of suspected was a problem were the struts that support the horizontal stabilizer. These are steel streamlined tubing. Initially they looked okay, but of course as I stripped the paint off of them, they are pitted pretty well, and they have dents. There's a nice little dent right there. That something happened to it. Of course, these things are pretty low to the ground. This thing taken off of a runway, grass runway, unapproved field, kicking up a rock, anything could have done that. This one, not too bad. This one, really bad. It has a really nasty dent right there that was not visible, kind of covered up, you know. There's one of the body works and Bondo there covering some of this stuff up. Now you look at this and go, well, is it airworthy? Well, it is. The airplane flew this way probably for years for this kind of damage. You probably could continue to fly it this way. But of course, doing a full restoration, you don't want to put something that visually looks pretty nasty. Also, maybe a safety concern, that dent might open up into a crack. So this is something we're going to have to look into. I've already put some feelers out there for some people. I would like to find actually an undamaged set somewhere. Hopefully that's out there. If not, then we're going to have to find somebody that's maybe made this streamlined tubing and take these apart and actually rebuild these pieces. So that's one thing we found that's going to slow us down. Another thing we removed off the airplane were the wingtips. The wingtips on the 108 are quite an interesting piece. They're actually magnesium skins. That's kind of this dark color with an aluminum internal parts. This is the left tip, and then initially when you first look at it, it doesn't look too bad, but if you take a really close look at it, this airplane and this tip have had some issues. There was some blunt damage that was done to this area here. Someone's kind of pushed it back out again, and they've done a really kind of nasty repair internally all the way around inside of here. So that's not very nice. The handle that was in here wasn't working properly because that was kind of bent and kind of warped out of shape. And also there was a repair done with a piece of aluminum out on the very end of the piece right there. Internally, after stripping some of the paint off of it, this rib here is garbage. It's corroded. It has a really nasty repair on it right here. Internally, it's also bad because this came off of the wing that had a lot of bird nests, either bird nests or rat nests. Couldn't figure out exactly what it was. Now that was all stuffed and piled up inside the tip. Of course, that caused moisture to set in, and there's a bunch of corrosion up inside of there also. So unfortunately, I was hoping that these were going to be nicer, but they are not. So this is something that's going to have to be probably completely redone. This is going to take a lot of time. This is sheet metal. Rick is going to have to take a look at them and decide what we can do with those. The other side, the right one, unfortunately, basically very nice shape. But then again, here we talk about the sins of other people. And what somebody did along the way on this airplane was they put radio equipment in it, which it didn't have originally. But it was being flown in South America, they had put radios in it. And someone decided to attach an aerial mast right to the tip here, which then they ran a wire from there to the fuselage. Well, this is steel, this is magnesium, there's aluminum in here, so now we got all kinds of dissimilar metal corrosion going on. Basically, it ate all this up corrosion-wise, and then somebody along the way grabbed a hold of this or ran into something, and of course it tore a giant hole into the tip. And it's really a shame because this is the only damaged spot on the tip. The rest of it is actually perfect. So can this be saved? Maybe. I'll have to show it to Rick. He's never actually done too much magnesium repair. It's something we don't come across too much on these airplanes. But again, a sin if that antenna wouldn't have been put on there. This tip probably would have been just perfect. But unfortunately, that has happened. Another thing, the fairing that goes on top of the vertical stabilizer. This is the vertical stabilizer right here to the 108. This piece slips over here like that. And again, the same thing was done to this. I'm not sure if this is magnesium or if it's just soft aluminum. Somebody decided, again, they're going to run an aerial on this thing. So they took this wonderful piece that they made. They did a nice job making that. But it's steel attached to an aluminum piece, setting up corrosion. A little bit like corrosion, not so bad, but the worst thing they did is they just took a bunch of like hardware store screws and they just screwed and hacked it in there. So now I got a bunch of nasty old holes inside of this piece. So hopefully this can be taken to a welder, which we have somebody that we go to, and they can possibly just nice and very carefully close all these holes up with some weld, and we can come back here and file that out and sand it out, and it should be savable. I like to use that as an original piece, has an original BF data plane on it right there. So again, another piece that unfortunately wasn't destroyed, but it was damaged in somebody else's sin. Another cool thing we kind of find along the way, not talking about damages, I always like to find things in the airplane that date the aircraft. And of course I took all the landing lights, not the landing lights, I say the wingtip lights out of the airplane. And of course these all have to be redone, the wiring's all bad, but the actual light assembly itself is dated September 1938. So that kind of gives us an idea that this airplane, of course, that we knew when it was built, but it kind of confirms that. There's another light, I think that was marked October 38 or October 37, maybe a little earlier. So it's cool to find those little dates along the way, kind of tells you a little bit of history of the airplane. The good thing, but the only good thing about the wingtips is that the little landing light, I was going to say landing light again, but the wingtip light lens is in perfect condition. It did not get broken. Probably a really hard item to find if you did break it, so hopefully that survived. And of course, as we take everything apart, everything goes into little bags, label the bag, because one thing happens during a restoration is, I've started this project right now, it may be 2 years or longer before I put this back on the airplane again. And if I just stick it in a bag or lay it on the shelf, I can guarantee you I'm going to forget what this is. So if it's not labeled and photographed, that's a big mistake. So it's very important to label all these pieces as we take them off the airplane. A couple other things we found, we took the ailerons and the flaps off the airplane. Of course, those look beautiful because they were all covered in fabric. Well, again, issues. The ailerons, actually not too bad. There's one aileron right here, and I believe this is the right aileron. This actually is great. No damage at all. Got some light corrosion on it. It has to be stripped of its old paint and recovered, but that's pretty decent. The other aileron, the same way. It has one little repair on the leading edge, which isn't too bad, but again, not so bad. But the flaps are a different story, so let's go take a look at those. All right, so we're going to take a look at the two flaps which were removed off the airplane. These are interesting, especially this one. This particular flap, although initially it looks pretty good, it does have some trailing edge damage, which isn't too big. That's pretty common on control surfaces, you see that. But for some reason, the leading edges of the flaps of this particular flap was re-skinned. Now, maybe there was some damage, it was dented, who knows. But what makes it really interesting is whoever did this, and it actually did a pretty decent job, and you could tell because the way the rivets are, it doesn't look like the original rivets that were used. But what's really strange is the material that they used. The piece of skin or aluminum that they used to repair it was taken off of something else because the inside of it, you can see, is actually painted green, and then there's actually white lettering on it. And we have no idea what that is, where it came from. I'm hoping that it's actually aircraft skin. Don't know. We have to kind of check and see what that is. It could have been something that was taken off another aircraft. It could have been something that was taken off the barn behind the hangar. Who knows? But basically, they just used what they had, and instead of actually cleaning all that off, they just left it on there, cut the piece, rolled it over, riveted it on. Is it good to go that way? Maybe. They actually did a pretty decent job of it. That's when I look at it, it's like, could I actually have done better? Maybe not. It's actually pretty decent. So we have to decide whether we want to retain that. It is kind of the history of the airplane. But a really interesting find. So that's the one flap. The other flap hadn't had all that done to it. It's an original piece. The leading edge is okay, but it has trailing edge damage. And I thought maybe that's all it was going to be. It was trailing edge damage. But then I started looking at it closer, and then someone did something strange. They drilled 2 holes in the spar of the flap. Now, they didn't really damage it so much, but they drilled these 2 big holes right here. And I'm trying to figure out, well, what were they trying to do? I didn't see any de-riveting or riveting going on, but what I did find out by actually kind of sanding it down lightly was that there must have been a dent here. And they did this to get behind there to knock out the dent. Now, why they put this hole here, I have no idea, because there's no dent on that side. The dent is only on this side. So go figure. Again, a really crazy sin or horrors that we find. Unfortunately, Some bad news there, which is going to slow us down. On the flip side of that, some good news. I took the tips off of the horizontal stabilizer, which are, again, magnesium, and that thing is perfect. Look at it. I'll strip the paint off of it. It's not cracked. There's no corrosion in it. It's actually like brand new. So even though you do find bad, you find good things along the way that kind of keep you going. So, because if you find everything bad, it gets a little depressing. But that piece is amazing. So again, we still have to uncover the rudder and the two elevators. Andrea has those. She's going to uncover those tomorrow. Hopefully, we keep our fingers crossed that there's nothing majorly wrong inside of those. Those pieces look good from the outside, but again, also did the flaps. And as we found out by opening up, we found some nasty stuff. One other thing we're going to show you, this is probably the worst thing I found, my worst fears. I'm going to go over and take a look at the wing and show you what we found there. All right, we're going to take a look at probably one of the worst things I found up to this point. I was hoping this wasn't something I was going to find, but it showed up on this particular wing. This is the right wing to the 108, and I was taking the control surfaces off. I had not opened up this wing like I had opened up the left wing. It has these nice big panels here, and I wanted to open up this wing to make sure that to get some of the nesting that was in. This is the wing that had the bird nest or the rat nest in it, and as I opened that up, of course, I found a whole bunch of that in there. I got that out. I got to do some more cleaning in there, but it did set up some light corrosion in there. Luckily, it didn't. Nothing too serious. It doesn't look like it's eaten through anything, but there is some corrosion on the spar back in this area here, which you can't see. But looking at it closer, I noticed this right here. But that is Bondo inside the wing, and I'm like, you have to be kidding me. Bondo inside the wing? If there's Bondo inside, what does the outside look like? So of course, I go to the outside. Take a picture. So we can see it. We'll come around this side here. And initially I couldn't see anything because it's filled. And so I took a little DA sander and I sanded away about a 1/4 inch of Bondo. And what you have here is a humongous dent on top of the wing. Now how this happened, who knows? It almost looks like something fell on top of it from above, a work stand, a ladder. Maybe it was in a hangar somewhere and something else fell on it, but it did a pretty bad job here. And I think it actually goes through and it actually cracks the skin. And I think that's why they bondoed the other side. Well, unfortunately, there's no such thing as structural Bondo. The good news is that the way the 108 wing is, and the 109 actually are very similar, the airplane is skinned in small sections. This skin actually starts from here and this ends here. So basically what we can do is we can de-rivet this skin, this small piece, remove it, check for any damage. I think that ribbon there might be damaged also because it's right up against that. And Rick will have to refabricate the skin for this particular wing. This was my fear because there's so much paint on the airplane that I thought I was going to stumble across this. As we strip the rest of the paint off the airplane, we hope we don't find too much more of this. There is that one spot on the fuselage that we talked about in one of the other videos. But hopefully, I've looked inside the wings. I don't see any signs of any other dents or body filler anywhere else. So hopefully this is the only bad spot. But it just kind of gives you the idea of what paint can hide. You can look at an airplane and go, man, that's gorgeous. That thing is beautiful. But as you start getting into it, you can find all kinds of crazy things. And it can be, it's somewhat depressing sometimes because it slows you down, but the whole thing with restoration, no matter what you're rebuilding, whether it's an airplane, a car, a house, I don't care what it is, a motorcycle, one thing you have to remember, it has to get ugly before it gets pretty. And sometimes it gets really ugly. And we're going to see some other things probably on the way along the way. But hopefully, that's the worst thing we find so far, but as we go along the project here, we're going to show what we find. Right, last thing we're going to talk about are some interesting little artifacts we found inside the airplane. Now, of course, as we go through restorations, we find some interesting things inside of them. One of the most interesting things I found was working on a Stinson 01 when we took the wings apart. I actually found a bucking bar in the wingtip. This is like about a 5-pound piece of steel that's used to buck rivets, and it was in the wingtip, and it was in the wingtip probably for quite some time. It didn't seem to do any damage, and we found tools, we found all kinds of things. But in the 108, Andrew was taking the fabric off of the flaps, and this was on both the right and left flaps. We found, the first thing we found, and it's kind of interesting because it doesn't look like it was brought in by an animal or something, because it's actually fairly intact, but it's actually a calendar. It's a Chilean calendar from 1956. We kind of pieced this thing together, and there's actually a piece of a rag in there, but this is a calendar that we're able to, there it is, there's a date right there, from 1956. So that of course dates the airplane to where it was in South America, which is also interesting, and also it dates as to when the control surfaces were either repaired or recovered, because apparently someone decided to stick this inside the flap. I'm not sure why. So that's kind of cool. Another thing we found was bits and pieces of a German magazine. That's a piece right there. It's all in German because, of course, there were a lot of Germans in Chile. The owner, almost all the people that own this airplane, except for Carlos Del Campo, were German. So it's a piece of, looks like it's out of a magazine or a newspaper with some kind of German advertisement. And also in the same flap, there was bits and pieces of a Chilean newspaper, all in Spanish, of course. You can't really see it. So that's pretty interesting. And then probably the coolest thing we found, this came out of the right flap, I believe. I guess after somebody was working very hard on the flap and had a tough day, they took out the little pack of Liberty cigarettes right there, and it's actually, they're from Chile. There's actually some fine blend of Chilean tobacco, and what it says right here, Liberty cigarettes contain Turkish and Virginia and Burley tobaccos, imported, blended, and guaranteed for your excellent quality by the manufacturer. So that's probably one of the coolest things I've actually seen inside of an airplane. And you could tell that's old. That's from the 1950s. So again, this goes back to when the airplane was repaired, sometime in the mid-50s, because of course there were some, the logbook does date some repairs that were done to the aircraft at that time. So there you go. Some cool artifacts we find along the way. Hope you found all this interesting. One of the coolest parts of restoration, of course, is finding the good and the bad and the interesting. And as we go through this restoration, we're going to keep you on tabs as to what we find and progress on the airplane as we progress through the restoration.